Hi, friends. Last week I found myself seated with a bunch of beautiful, lovely single women, and we talked about living single. And I was really inspired to come back home and to re record it so that I could share about it on a broader scale. How do we live single? Living single. And I joked with him and said, I wasn't even a single woman, but I felt that as a mom of five people, young adults who have just stepped in to the dating world, I started asking myself if they were equipped for such a journey. Are my children equipped to be single in this world? I came across this story in the Bible, which you're going to think, what has that got to do with being single? So we find ourselves in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 13 and 14. 1 Samuel chapter 13 and 14. And there's this story told, and I'm just going to touch on a little bit of the story, but it's going to be very much related to what I want to talk about. It says in verse 19, not a blacksmith could be found in the whole land of Israel, because the Philistines had said, otherwise the Hebrews will make swords or spears. So all Israel went down to the Philistines to have their plow points, their mattocks, their axes, their sickles, their knives, their swords sharpened. The price, there was a cost to doing this, and it gives the price in verse 21 for sharpening forks, axes, and repointing gourds. So on the day of battle, not a soldier with Saul and Jonathan had a sword or spear in his hand. Only Saul, King Saul, and his son Jonathan had them. Woo! So we have here a scene where, for some reason or another, all the blacksmiths, all the people who sharpened weapons that were fit for battle, had either been murdered, abducted. It doesn't really say what had happened to them, but the children of Israel found themselves with no weapons. There were only two weapons left, and that was the one that was being yielded by their king and Jonathan, his son. But it says a few verses before this that actually Saul was no longer to be king because he had disobeyed. He had done something that had upset the prophet Samuel, and Samuel had said, "Hey, look, you've disobeyed. The throne and the lineage of the throne is no longer in your house." So Saul, I think, was feeling a little bit depressed, and it said in this text that he was so discouraged because the armies of the Philistines had surrounded them in three regiments. Three regiments had surrounded them. They were feeling hopeless. Some of the children of Israel had gone to run into caves. Some had crossed over to the other side of the Jordan, and they were afraid. They were afraid. They were fearful. So I brought here a pomegranate because it says that Saul, King Saul, was actually at this point seated or sitting under a pomegranate tree. And a pomegranate spoke a lot about promise, God's promises, the promised land. It's a very complicated fruit. But you see, after more than 400 years of being in exile in Egypt, when Joshua and Caleb were sent into the land to go and see what was up against them before they crossed over to the promised land, Caleb and Joshua came back holding some pomegranates, loads of pomegranates, which nobody had ever seen, and grapes and all sorts of things that grew in the promised land. And so this fruit was a representation of sitting under God's promise. But there sat Saul, depressed, yielding the only other sword in the kingdom, the other one his son had. He was sitting discouraged. It actually says, I think he was sitting next to the great grandson of Eli the priest, who was wearing his worship robes with him. They had the worship robes, they had the priest, they had the sort of sitting under this promise of God. But you know who wasn't there in all that? God. God was no longer there. God was no longer under that facade. So there was fear. And I find sometimes that we find ourselves depressed or sitting under what we thought was God's promise, but something's gone wrong and we are too fearful to move. So this is what happens. And I want to read this clearly. What happens is when we find ourselves under stress, and stress is a position, it's what happens when there's an external force or attack or demand. As a result of that, we have an emotional response to the stressful situation position. We have an emotional response, and that emotional response can be anxiety or fear. And all the unknowns can come and really stress us out, and we find ourselves sort of not able to take on what is coming at us, not able to have the capacity to withstand. And when we don't have the weapons, and these people physically did not have the weapons there with them, they did not have the weapons there that they could use, or even have a blacksmith around that who could have shown them how to use the raw materials that they had available, so that they could take up those raw materials and possibly turn them into something useful in their lives to fight with and combat the forces that were coming up against them. So no weapons. They found themselves with no weapons and no blacksmith. And I looked at this and I said, wow, this is looking familiar. I have a whole lot of young people who I'm mentoring, who I've raised, who find themselves with no raw materials to forge any kind of weapon that could possibly be useful in this world in terms of finding healthy relationships. So I pose the question, like, what are some of the differences that we are seeing in this day and age that possibly were not there, like in my generation when I started dating? When I started dating, I got married. I calculated that on average, a person my age got married. Our kids are getting married on average about 6 years later than we did, and possibly on average, and this is just on a working average of the people I know, about 10 years later than their grandparents got married. Wow. And not only that, but the world has moved on leaps and bounds in terms of technology and in the way how relationships are conducted. For example, when I was growing up, we didn't have dating apps. We didn't have hooking up apps. We didn't have a little thing, a little box that controlled all our lives and all our anxieties and our feelings and our fears and our potentials and not potential. And we didn't have television, so many channels and so much visualization and sexualization of women and objectifying women. And I find that, as my friend was saying this evening, love is awakened way before its time. People are teenagers when when they awaken love. And by the time they get to their 20s, there's kind of a weariness and fatigue. And yet, there is not a blacksmith to be found to help them out. There's no weapon, no weapon. So I know that with a few people, I have raised my hand and said, hey, I will be your blacksmith. I am going to help you navigate this mess of relationships. So right now, I want you all to think about where your anxiety is. Where is your anxiety? Where is the anxiety jumping up? And how are you equipped or not equipped for it? Where is your anxiety jumping up? And how are you equipped or not equipped for it? As with anything in life, I find that we have to fight for it. There is not a place in my life that I've had a promise or potential that I haven't had to fight for. There's never been a place or a thing that I haven't had to fight for. And how many of you know that we are in a war? We are in a war. I mean, even gravity is at war with us. Time is at war with us. There are so many battles. And so I find that when the children of Israel were facing the army, the organized, weaponized army of the Philistines, it says that the Philistines had 3 regiments that were positioned against them, surrounding them. And I thought, I want to give those regiments names. And so I came up with 3 things. 3 things that represent the 3 positions that represent the regiments. The three things or detachments that are opposing us as the enemy are, number 1, the world system and its culture. The world system and its culture. The arbitrary, very arbitrary constructions of human divisions in all areas of our lives. And then we have the flesh. Our very own flesh is another detachment. It's another force attacking us. Our flesh, our fleshy desires. And then lastly, we have the devil, the enemy. The old timer, the old enemy who has learned so much about humanity that he has so much coming up at us. So I want to look at these one at a time. So first, let's look at the world system and the culture. It says the world is unprincipled. It's a dog-eat-dog world out there. The world does not, fight fair. But we don't live or fight our battles that way. Never have and never will. The tools of our trade aren't for marketing or manipulation, but they are for demolishing the entire massively corrupt culture. We use our powerful God tools for smashing warped philosophies, tearing down barriers erected against the truth of God, fitting every loose thought and emotion and impulse into the structure of a life shaped by Christ. Our tools are ready at hand for clearing the ground of every obstruction and building lives of obedience into maturity. But what are these tools? We're going to talk about that. So I was saying things are always a fight. We have to fight for it, even if we're in the promised land. Saul was sitting in the promised land. In the promised land. We have to fight because our promises aren't being handed to us on a platter. There's always a fight for it. We find ourselves depressed, hurt, stuck, and we have to fight to find our joy against the depression, against so that we can find our purposes in God again. So things don't come easy. We have a battle, and we are battling on a world principalities level. We are battling on a bigger context than we could ever think. And you know what? It says that every time the Israelites wanted their farming equipment sharpened, they had to go to the Philistines, which represents the world. And whenever we go as children of God to the world to get our tools sharpened, to get equipped, there's always going to be a cost. There is always going to be a cost to getting our weapons from the world. And it actually lists there in my example the cost of what each tool costs. It's amazing when we get our satisfaction in the world, when we go to the world for our advice, for our healing, for our purposes, we end up coming back under even more bondage. Under even more bondage. Whenever we go to get our weapons from the world, it will cost us. It will cost us. It will cost us. And sometimes we will have to come back. Oh, I'll get into that later as well. The second regiment, the second detachment is the flesh. We live. How do we live? How do we live? The flesh can be a very tricky thing because a lot of the time, because we have no weapons and no blacksmith, we have been going to the world, into the world, to get our answers, to get our weapons, and we find that we are now living, we're not now living not really the way that we want to live. We live, we start to have what I want to call cognitive dissonance, where it is the cognitive dissonance is the discomfort a person feels when their behavior does not align with their values or beliefs. Woo! Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort a person feels when their behavior does not align with their values or beliefs. This is tough because what then happens is we are living under a false identity. And when we are living under a false identity, we start to live fearfully. We are fear-filled, and we start acting in the flesh, and we project hostility onto ourselves and shame on ourselves and onto others. So we get disappointed in our behaviors, and we are just filled with shame, and we start ordering our lives around that shame. We start avoiding the healthy friendships because we are living under shame. We start to hide. Maybe it might not be like physical hiding, like not getting out of your house, but we start maybe to take more of this thing, like drinking a little bit more, watching a little bit more TV, just feeling like we don't belong anymore. We start to be ashamed of who we are. We start to be what can I say? Thinking that we are not enough. We are the disappointment. We are the shame. We are the problem. And a lot of the words that I'm hearing from young people is imposter syndrome. You only really feel imposter syndrome if you're feeling ashamed of yourself. So we start to put all this hostility on ourselves and others. And we start to do a lot of blaming. We blame others for our fear, and we blame others for our shame. We blame others, and we become victims of our own doing. We become victims, and we stop taking responsibility of our own lives. We start to really hide. We also become jealous of others, um, because we are so fearful of our future, and fearful of taking the lead of our and responsibility of our own lives. And lastly, the third regiment or detachment of the Philistines that I want to like name what it is, bring it into our reality, was the enemy, the devil, Satan, who is roaring around like looking for whom he may devour. He is roaring around because it says that the enemy comes to steal, to kill, and to destroy. And so there's a scripture in the Bible that talks of Cain, about, hey, Cain, they sin crouching at the door of your heart. Will you respond and do the right thing? Because if you do the right thing, will you not be rewarded? But if you don't do the right thing, sin is going to devour you. I'm butchering the quote, but that's basically it. Devouring. The enemy is looking for someone to devour. So I've been wondering, oh my goodness, are we in a battle without a blacksmith? Are we at war where we don't have the weapons for it? Wow. Are we at war where we don't have a battle for it? So what to do? What to do? So hold that thought. What to do? So, Saul, the king, he's depressed. He's lost the kingdom. He's lost the lineage. He's sitting under a promise where God is no longer there. But we have his son Jonathan. And it says that when Jonathan and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire. No, that's the wrong verse. That's the wrong verse. Okay, so Jonathan gets to leaves where his father is, under the pomegranate tree. But I wanted to give another example. David. A few chapters after this, you see, Saul starts to pursue David because he was now going to be the king, the new anointed king. And there's a little story there where David finds when David and his men reached this Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters had been taken captive. And it says David does three things. He goes into lament. He is devastated. He is depressed, just like Saul, depressed, but he does something about it. He's proactive about it. He is proactive about it. It says he laments before God, cries out before God. All that we read in most of the book of the Psalms, the chapters in Psalms, are some of David's laments. He laments. He cries out to God so that he's just pours out his heart, pours out his feeling, pours out his fears, pours out his anxiety, pours it all out. And when it is all gone, he then calls for his worship robes, he calls for his priests, and he says he does three things. He says, should I go after them, after my wife, my household, and my children? Should I go? How should I go? He inquires of the Lord with the priest. And will I win? Whenever David came across a situation, he always, should I go? Should I pursue? Is it something I should pursue? Should I pursue this route? Should I go after them? Should I get fresh direction and answer? Should I get new direction, fresh connection with God? He strengthens himself with God. He gets fresh connection with God. And then he gets connected with God and says, God, should I go? Should I go after my wives and children? Yes, you may go. How should I go? He inquires of God. How should I go? You go this way, do this, and then will I win? Even when God says go, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win. Just because God says go doesn't mean you're going to win. You still have to inquire, will I win? How do we do this? So anyway, let's go back to Jonathan. Jonathan sees that there's hopelessness in his camp. So he says he took his armor bearer and he does exactly, excuse me, duck. What? He does exactly what David does. Jonathan takes his armor bearer and his sword and he goes to the Lord and he says, Lord, this is what I'm going to do. I will go, and if I do this, it means you're with me. If this happens, it means you're not with me. If this happens, so he basically says, I'm going to go up to that hill where there is a detachment, one of the detachments of the Philistines, and I'm going to call out to them, hey, he insults them, hey, you guys up there, you uncircumcised, whatever, come down here and fight us. And he says to the Lord, if they come down, we are gone. But if they say, come up here, you Hebrews, and fight from up here, we know that we have them. So what happens is they say, oh, you guys, come up here and fight us if you really want to fight. Should I go? How should I go? And will we win? That is called being proactive. So how's this got to do with dating? We'll get there. So I find that with all the changes that have happened in the world, especially with girls, especially with ladies, that this is one area that us as ladies dating have been given this false freedom. And I want to talk about that false freedom. It goes something like this. Girls don't have I want to call it what it is. Girls are not allowed to be proactive in where they should go in these relationships. So let me just go into this. How do I do this? Okay, let's see if I can find this. Okay, here we go. I want to read this law of proactivity. There is a need for us all to get out of powerlessness. There is a need for us all to get out of powerlessness, right? Because I find that in terms of relationships, dating relationships, a lot of the people that I speak to are in a reactive stance to dating. They are not proactive. They are not, they are not, what can I say? What am I thinking? I've written here that proactive people show you what they love. they tell you what they want. They have a purpose. They tell you what they purpose, what they stand for. These people are very different from those who are known by what they don't like, what they hate, what they stand against, and what they will not do. Reactive people are primarily known for their against stances. Proactive people do not demand rights, they live them. You see, proactive people are able to go and get what they want in a loving way, and when they don't get what they want, they are just not defeated or stranded. They get past that, and they continue to pursue as a powerful person their wants, and they own their future. They own their what can I say? They take responsibility of their lives. They take the responsibility of where they're going and what they want. And they learn from every situation, and they own the treasures that they find in every situation in their soul. They own the treasures that they find in every difficulty, so that they can learn for their next steps. They don't stay in the same position. They're growth oriented. They live in their real identity, in who they are, and in who they are in Christ. In Christ, it is not sufficient to ask, and it is not sufficient to have to put the responsibility of who you are and your purposes and the things that God has built in you into other people's hands. It is not sufficient, and it will never be sufficient, to put what God has purposed for you and for your life, for your relationships, and especially the relationship, into other people's hands. You have to take responsibility of it yourself and say, God, should I go? How should I go? And will I win? But you see, I find a lot of girls are stuck in this holding pattern. I haven't seen guys being stuck in this kind of holding pattern before, where they're not quite sure whether this guy is with them or is dating them, but they're gonna hang out with him. They're gonna hang out with him because he might be dating them. They don't take the wisdom to inquire about it. I find that even as my kids have been growing up through middle school, through high school, I've seen how middle schoolers do it, and I've seen how high school students do it. They might even do something as simple as sending a friend to say, hey, so-and-so likes you. What do you think? And then that person says, oh, okay, I'll go with them to the dance. Very simple things. Or they might say, hey, excuse me, I like so-and-so. I think I'm going to start going to the paint class that they go to, They take the responsibility of their own life. They don't put it wholly and solely into someone else. My husband has actually coined one of the biggest PR stunt right now are guys who don't say what really their intention is with that girl at that time. And they hang out with them. So he names it he calls it the barking dog syndrome. It's a guy who's always seen with the same girl, ruff, 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 but never makes the move, the bold move of actually letting everybody know what is going on there. Or what does Tendai call it again? He calls it the dog in a manger syndrome. It is this guy with this girl. It's like a dog in a manger. So let's stick to one analogy at a time. Dog in a manger. There's hay in a manger. There's horses standing outside to come and eat the hay, to try out the hay. But there is a dog there. He's barking loudly. And those that could actually eat of the hay cannot go in because there is something, but we don't know what, going on. So just barking. Ruff, 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 ruff. Or there's another one called, that Tendai says there's a supermarket in South Africa called Pick n Pay, where you pick what you want and you pay for it. But guys don't pay. They just pick, and not pay. And basically you pay with your words, okay? So I remember when Tendai asked me out, he was like straight up from the get-go, hey, so I want to date. I don't date girls for the purpose of just checking them out. I date girls to find out if we should get married or not. I date girls for the purposes of seeking marriage. So we will date and we will be seeking whether it's from the Lord, whether we should get married. He gave it a purpose from the get-go. There was no fooling around. He equipped that thing. He empowered that thing. He weaponized that thing. No fooling around. But now there's just this holding pattern that not sure where people are going. Right? So Jonathan goes for it. He goes for it. He asks the Lord, will he go up? There's also another story about just being proactive that I love in the Bible. And then I will go into ways of how to be equipped, how to be weaponized, how to have the weapon in our hands, so that we can go and fight. But there is a story that I really like, and it's also about David. David is out herding his flock. Okay, let's stop there for a minute.